Ebrahim, what are the options available to opposition parties in terms of cooperation?
Well, clearly I think there's plenty of options which are available to them. They could strike informal agreements in which they would wish to cooperate with each other, and this seems to be happening at National Parliament, in which they take certain positions in certain committee deliberations. We've seen this happen with respect to the way in which they commonly agreed to oppose Jacob Zuma's nomination, which was in fact a nomination, but he said it's an appointment to the Constitutional Court bench, and the head of that, they've come together about some instances with respect to the Judicial Services Commission's investigation into the Judge Slope matter, but that about is as far as this commonality seems to go. Now, whether they can strike a partnership beyond some instances in which they agree to cooperate, that remains to be seen, but that certainly is an option, striking a degree of partnership. And there is some experience of having struck partnerships, particularly the Cape Town City Metropolitan Council, some municipalities in the Western Cape. So that's the second option, partnership. The third would be the question of going into a more formal alliance. But this formal alliance would require that they would have to spell out who would be responsible for what, who would carry out which functions, who would assume which leadership positions in which councils, how they would go into fighting an election, who would be the leadership and the public face of that alliance in an election, in which areas, if it's going to be a local government election. So clearly there's lots of preconditions if they go into a formal alliance, and much of those preconditions would also have to include who would bring what resources to the alliance, who would bring what constituency and what membership. And then there's the more important ideological political questions about how they would craft a common policy platform. So while in this alliance they may wish to retain certain degrees of distinct policies, they would have to find common ground and sufficient common ground amongst all 5, 6, 7 or 8 of them to be able to craft something which is which can bind them together. Because if there's more that they differ on and less that they can actually stand together on, it will be very difficult for them to actually strike a complete alliance.
Getting back to the alliance firstly, is an alliance a collection of separate parties working together for one cause? They remain separate?
That is indeed the case, that they retain their individual identities, and in that set of individual identities they craft some common ground among themselves which they then work together. But that common ground forms the grand strategy of what they wish to achieve. So it's not the tactical commonalities that they can find which binds an alliance, it's the strategic outlook of an alliance which actually keeps the alliance together. So if it's going to be a grand programmatic strategy and a vision which they craft for South Africa, in terms of the broad policy trajectory, in terms of the values, in terms of what they would like to see, in terms of the political outlook and the political values of the society, whether it be in international relations, whether it be the way in which Parliament will function in response to the executive, together with the way in which Parliament and the executive would respond to civil society, how they would craft policy. If the grand vision centers around that, it's easier to bind together an alliance. But if their commonalities are merely tactical, it's about winning particular municipalities, or it's about opposing Jacob Zuma's nomination to the Constitutional Court, or if it's about winning a minor victory, for instance, on shaping industrial policy on a very particular and small issue, those tactical alliances are more amenable to partnerships and cooperative agreements rather than to broad alliances, because there is no grand strategic vision which would hold them together. And then lastly, of course, you get coalitions. Coalitions, of course, generally are used to describe governments. And when a coalition is formed to not only achieve a certain governance goal, but also to construct an administration and an executive edifice in the state. And often there is much experience of coalition governments, particularly in Europe and Germany and West Germany, for instance, before the Cold War, is a very good example of countries where coalition governments have functioned very effectively. The same is true for a country like Israel, where certain grand strategic visions in the way in which Israel's constructed, or the nationhood of Israel's constructed, in opposition to the Palestinians, in opposition to world public opinion, in response to constructing the Israeli state as a homogenous state in relation to its society. Their coalitions, because they were driven by this grand strategy and this grand vision of what they presumed Israel to be and wanted it to be, coalition governments work. The same was true for a country like India, where there is some history of coalition governments working, also driven by grand strategies rather than mere tactical alliances. And so the question, I think, for many of the opposition parties this time round, particularly in South Africa, is what is their grand strategy driving the commonality that they wish to pursue? If it's simply going to be a short-lived tactical opposition to the ANC, it may actually work for a short period of time. But in the medium to long term, it will prove unsustainable, and it will be a consensus which will begin to fracture rather than keep them together and keep them gelling together.
Can you tell us a bit more about the 1994 Government of National Union in relation to what you've spoken about of coalitions? Is there place for such a coalition 15 years down the line?
Well, some people would argue that the Government of National Unity immediately post South Africa's transition is an example of a kind of coalition government, but the driving forces behind it, the vision which constructed that set of parties coming together in government, had a completely different set of objective conditions and a different context, a different historical period even, with different pressures. Which drove those degrees of commonality and drove those parties to come together. And we must appreciate, I think, the historical and contextual context within which that Government of National Unity occurred. For one, it was immediately post the transition. We had come out of 48, 50 years of apartheid and many years of colonialism. There was deep fractures in the society on the basis of race, but also on the basis of income, inequalities, serious degrees of oppression, very high levels of violence, and very serious degrees of fracture and polarization amongst the society. And so to promote degrees of reconciliation, to bring parties together into a more consensus-based approach towards the transition and towards ushering in the beginnings of a democracy, I think most parties found it relevant and useful to come together in this kind of constructed coalition, in this rainbow nation, if you will, because it was a period in South African history which required large degrees of consensus for people to keep the stability in the society and forge a social consensus that new structures, a new state edifice, a new administrative regime, new executive processes, and a new construction of commonality and a new construction of South Africa was required. So that consensus-driven approach lasted for a while. But of course, whether those objective conditions exist now, particularly amongst opposition parties, is a different question. I'm not sure that those objective conditions exist with respect to the political drivers in our society. They may, some people argue, exist with respect to the kind of development initiatives we need and the consensus which is required to provide political governance for development. In that respect, a greater degree of consensus is required, particularly when one looks historically, for instance, countries like Germany and in many parts of Western Europe and in some of the Nordic countries. The initial years after the post-Second World War development was constructed on the basis of coalition politics because it was driving towards a greater amount of consensus seeking, and that consensus seeking also drove greater amounts of development. The same is true for what some people call the East Asian miracles, where you could forge a social consensus, not on the basis of political coalitions, but on the basis of a unified social vision for development. Then you could forge through this consensus-based development approach. But in a society where different interests, like South Africa, where different interests congeal and coalesce around different organizations, I think it's very difficult to assume that you can always construct political coalitions and political consensus merely for the question of development, because in South Africa the question of development, where development should lie and what kind of development is severely contested, and that I think gives rise to the kind of ideological and political plurality that we've experienced so far. Now, whether opposition parties believe that the political legitimacy and the political consensus they require to drive through their vision of development can find sufficient support in the society doesn't seem to actually bear out the assertion. Because if one looks at the recent election results, you would find that many, of course, of the opposition parties didn't fare as well as the ANC did, and I think that's obvious. Of course, parties like the Democratic Alliance fared better than they did in 2004, and the Congress of the People, of course, a new party, did relatively well. But most other political parties, particularly in opposition or outside the governing party, performed rather poorly. For instance, the United Democratic Movement, the Independent Democrats, and those two are two prime movers with many of the two key other opposition parties, the DA and COPE, for this kind of coalition. So here you find in the practical strategic calculations that political parties will make for this coalition that there is little that drives the same interests amongst them for constructing these kind of coalitions as you may have had in 1994. And so the context, because it's so different and the strategic calculations are going to be different, the ability for them to more easily craft consensus is going to be that much harder. Of course, the opposition parties then, when they try to construct these partnerships, will be asking serious questions about what they actually bring to the table. And what they bring to the table is vastly different. Of course, the large amount of and concentration of resources lies within, in part, the Democratic Alliance and COPE. The ID doesn't seem to bring, for one, as large a constituency that may have been assumed it would bring, nor does the United Democratic Movement, nor do those two parties bring a large and vast amount of resources. So they're both at a disadvantage with respect to the kind of constituencies they bring, but also the kind of resources they bring. They might then have a better political vision, but depending on how they negotiate the kind of partnership they would want to enter with the Democratic Alliance and COPE, the hegemony for whose kind of policy vision and whose policy identity will animate the whole alliance or coalition or partnership will be one which is contested, as will be the question of the leadership, as will be the question of what kind of numbers do you actually bring and where is your support concentrated. Because if we look at many of these political parties' support, both in this 2009 election as well as the previous local government election, the DA seems to have some support across the country. With respect to local government, they do and can also claim that there is a concentration of support in particular areas, and because of the local government system, in local government the concentration of support in particular geographic areas is important. With respect to the Congress of the People, there is no history with respect to their political support in the last local government elections, but the 2009 election results seem to suggest that while they have close to 8% support tested in an election, that support is spread across the country, which of course I'm sure they're quite glad about, but with respect to local government elections, there is very little concentration of their support in any particular geographic area. So their ability to be able to contest local elections on a localized basis and find a critical mass of support located in those particular areas seems to be low. With respect to the Independent Democrats and the UDM, the other two key players in this discussion of partnerships and alliances and coalitions, they seem to have some concentrated support but localized in two particular provinces. With respect to the Independent Democrats, it seems to be the Western Cape, the Northern Capes, and some parts of smatterings in the Northwest and the Free State, but the United Democratic Movement is the Eastern Cape. So clearly all these dynamics as a mix will come together to determine how they strategically decide who's going to be dominant in this kind of partnership. Then with respect to the kind of actual partnership or coalition that they engage in and enter into, you know, there's so many different options that they can actually explore. But the most difficult option is the option they seem to be taking, and that option is, particularly with respect to the local government elections, to strike some kind of agreement before they go into an election. And before you go into an election, there is a lot more at stake for political parties to have to decide. Who contributes what, who holds which leadership position, under whose banner will they contest if they decide to rally around one individual candidate or one set of parties in a particular locality. And much of these strategic calculations become even more complex because we have a dual system, electoral system at local government level. One pure 50% PR, proportional list, and 50% on the individual elected in a constituency, on a constituency basis, in a first past the post system. So on the first past the post system, they will have to decide which party's candidate or all the other opposition parties will rally around and give support. On the proportional list system, that will be open to a whole new set of considerations about how they would contest that portion of the election, and under whose auspices, under whose banner, who's likely to get the greatest amount of support in a particular locality. So I think the idea that they're mooting about discussing this before an election, particularly with respect to local government, given the complexities, is going to throw up a lot more strategic calculations and strategic fights amongst them than they're letting on, firstly. Secondly, those individual organizations' own internal problems are going to manifest themselves on the way in which they adopt their approaches to discussions with other political parties. So if the Congress of the People has had leadership squabbles, has had the inability to craft common policy positions so early on with respect to a national election, it's very difficult to assume that there is a large-scale consensus within the Congress of the People for the kind of partnership agreements and alliances and coalitions that some of in the leadership may wish to strike. The same is probably true in other political parties, but is not as manifest. So that's just some of the problems they will have to deal with. It would be much easier for them to strike some kind of agreement if they go into post-election agreements. That means decide on an area-by-area or case-by-case basis how they would go together and what kind of agreements they're going to strike. But clearly all of this is going to require lots of negotiation and a lot more work with respect to constructing commonality amongst them rather than simply being anti-ANC, which is really what will drive either the success or their failure.
If post the 2011 local government elections they were to look at who's won which constituency, that kind of thing, then decide how they're going to bring their votes together.
Or yes, how they would bring their votes together, but how they would begin to work together given which candidates have been elected and on what basis they'd be able to work together. I think the real difficulty for many of the opposition parties is what they would have to prove is two things. They have to prove, A, that they enjoy an equal amount of social and political legitimacy as the ANC and the alliance and the ANC's alliance does, and secondly, that they can actually govern better than the ANC does and can in many of the local municipalities and elsewhere. The problem with proving that you can actually govern better than the ANC means, particularly in the system that we've accepted as a consensus, that establishing the right amount of social and political legitimacy is a precondition to being able to prove that you can govern better. It is very difficult for you to prove that you can govern if you don't actually have the chance to govern. And to get the chance to govern, you must actually test your social and political legitimacy in an election. And clearly for large numbers of South Africans that hasn't happened yet. It may have happened in the Western Cape, it may have happened in certain local municipalities in Cape Town, in the Western Cape province, and maybe that is some indication for some people around the country that some opposition parties and some other political parties may in fact govern better than the ANC. But it would be difficult to use that simply as a proxy to suggest that there is a clear case to be made for opposition parties simply to come together, because there's some people who might believe in some parts of the country that that is indeed the case, which is why I think it would be easier for them to first test their own support in an election, particularly local government elections, and then decide on what basis they wish to come together. That would have and seems to be working better for the opposition parties when they kind of constructed this routine of working post the 2009 national elections, because clearly there was not enough before the national elections to bring them together. Clearly there is something after the elections which is making it slightly easier for them to work together than would have been the case before an election. So clearly I think the same kind of impetus may militate against their forging something coherent before the 2011 local government elections. But if, of course, they can get and cut through all of the strategic and tactical considerations and their own interest-based considerations and the negotiations around who will bring what, whose relative strengths, and then decide on a common policy outlook and common political platform, then of course, they could strike something. But there is something quite curious going on in the society as a whole, in the sense that while there seems to be the beginnings of some congealing amongst some of the opposition political parties, if we can call them that, there is at the same time a degree of policy fracturing within the African National Congress Alliance. And you find that soon after the ANC was elected, there's been protests on the streets, there have been massive number of strikes, there have been policy fallouts on some issues, particularly and most notably, even though it seems silly, on the question of what kind of perks ministers are entitled to. And of course, the question of race, the resolution of the national question about who's been appointed to which positions in cabinet and on what racial basis, recalling what Julius Malema was saying about the fact that it doesn't seem as if Africans have been appointed to the economic cluster in the ministries. Of course, if one brings up all of these minor fractures which seem to be animating the alliance, there's the African National Congress Alliance on the one hand, which is beginning to fracture, and some beginnings of congealing on the one side, on the other side amongst opposition parties, seem to be suggesting that there may be settling and there may be some consensus driving happening in the middle ground. But of course that might still happen over a long period of time. But this is, I think, an interesting observation, that while there is fracturing going on one hand, there is a degree of congealing and partnership building on the other, and more consensus seeking on the other. While the political fracturing seems to be occurring within the African National Congress Alliance, there is a emerging governance consensus on the opposition side. So the fracture and the partnership is driven by two different things. The partnership is driven by governance. The fracture within the alliance is driven by politics. So it's not clearly only politics which is driving the partnership kind of movement amongst opposition parties. But of course, clearly, this might still fracture in very many different ways over time. But I mean, this is the early beginnings that South African society is beginning to settle on the basis of more interest-based coalitions occurring, and a greater degree of political fracturing happening away from the kind of manufactured consensus we've been used to with respect to the ANC, with respect to the alliance, with respect to anti-apartheid politics pre-1990, and transition politics and the consensus for transition from 1990 to 1994. So clearly there's a historical shift beginning to occur in South Africa.